Sure. Thank you, Kate. Very pleased to be with you this morning and see such a bright and shiny, large group of folks who I hope are very interested in this topic. Let me put in some context sort of how China and the United States fit in Africa today, at least from my optic. And I'll do it in the context of what are our respective interests in Africa. And when I talk about interests, I'm talking about hard interests. What do China and the United States want from Africa, not what they can do for Africa? Those are very different things. So I'm going to suggest that there are 5 things that China wants from Africa, and then I'll very quickly do the same thing for the United States. In the first instance, China wants access to African natural resources. 85% of all African exports to China are oil and minerals or other natural resources. About 85% of all Chinese exports to Africa are value-added manufactured goods. That's interest number 1. Interest number 2 is China wants the support, the political support, of as many African countries as it can obtain. 54 countries in Africa. When I talk about Africa, I use the whole continent. I don't divide it into sub-Saharan and North Africa. So China wants the political support of as many of the 54 countries as it can possibly get. China has diplomatic relations with 52 of the 54 countries. Burkina Faso and Swaziland recognize Taiwan. Which leads us to the third interest of China in Africa, and that is to have the diplomatic recognition of all 54 countries. It would like to see Burkina Faso and Swaziland at some point switch their representation from Taipei to Beijing. So that's interest number 3. Interest number 4 is exporting the maximum amount that it can to African countries because that earns foreign exchange for China. Now, the African market in the grand scheme of global trade is not huge for China. It's only about 5% of China's global trade. Nevertheless, 5% is 5%, and it would like to increase the amount of exports that it sells to the African countries. The fifth and the last interest that China has in Africa is to avoid all of the potential negative problems that could negatively impact Chinese interests or the Chinese presence in Africa or in the waters around Africa or conceivably even in the Chinese homeland. This is everything from countering terrorism to avoiding international crime, anti-piracy, narcotics trafficking, anything that's bad, that's negative, that could harm Chinese interests or personnel in Africa. It wants to avoid. Those are the 5 things that China wants from Africa. Now, what it can do for Africa is very different in things like economic development and cordial political relations, etc., but I don't consider those as hard interests. Now, very quickly, what does the U.S. want from Africa? Well, it wants access to oil and, to a lesser extent, minerals. It wants the political support of as many African countries as it can obtain. The U.S. has diplomatic relations with all 54 countries on the continent. It wants to export as many American products to the continent as it possibly can. It doesn't have this issue of Taiwan, so that's the one distinction between China's policy and U.S. policy that separates us in terms of what our hard interests are. The United States also wants to avoid all of the negative issues that I listed in the case of China. Those same negative factors apply to the United States, and the U.S. wants to make sure those don't impact the United States negatively. And the United States has a fifth interest, which China does not yet have, but perhaps which China is approaching, and that is that the U.S. wants to have access to African ports for U.S. naval vessels It wants to have the ability to overfly the continent for U.S. military aircraft as necessary, and it wants to be able to land in African airports as necessary in order to support whatever military operations it might have around the world. As I say, I don't think China is at this point yet, even with its new facility, military facility. I would argue it's a base in Djibouti. Maybe China will be at this point, at some point in the next 10 years, but not there yet. Let me just say also generally that the one thing about Africa in terms of the China-Africa or the China-U.S. connection is that it's essentially neutral territory. It's the one part of the world where neither the United States nor China has sort of deep core interests, and therefore it makes it a location where there can be cooperation more effectively and more easily than in any other part of the world. Asia is obviously considered to be in the backyard of China. Latin America is in the backyard of the United States. Europe is closely aligned, for the most part, with the United States. And these are areas that are somewhat more difficult in terms of China-U.S. cooperation. Because Africa is essentially a neutral location, it does, I think, lend itself far more readily to U.S.-China collaboration. And I've been making that argument for years, and I continue to believe that is the case. Kate, I'd be happy to stop there if you wish, and I haven't really gone into the background of the development of the China relationship in Africa, but if there's time for that at some point, I'll be happy to do it.
Why don't you say a few words on that, just
Okay.
as you see the evolution of China's approach and view towards Africa?
Yeah. The evolution of China's relationship with Africa is quite surprising, particularly if you look at the last 20 years. When China initially went into Africa in the 1960s and 1970s, it was essentially, during the Cold War, it was essentially to support African liberation movements, occasionally even to support some very left-wing African groups that were trying to topple independent African governments. A very well-documented case in Cameroon, for example, of trying to overthrow the Ahidjo government. So it was a very political period, very ideological, very Cold War focused. Now that began to change in the 70s, where China's policy became more pragmatic, and with each passing decade it became more and more pragmatic, to the extent that you got to the mid-1990s, and China's focus towards Africa changed enormously and became heavily economic, much less political, with a desire to focus on trade, to focus on foreign direct investment, to focus on the winning of contracts, to build all of these big infrastructure projects in Africa. Clearly an economic focus, and that's, I think, represented by these 5 interests that I just laid out. China became Africa's largest trading partner in 2009, and it has only increased the distance between its trading record with Africa and the number 2 trader with Africa since 2009. It passed the United States in 2009. In fact, today, the United States is not even the second largest trading partner with Africa. It's about number 4. India has surpassed the United States, and France has passed the United States in terms of bilateral trade. China is a major source of foreign direct investment in Africa today. It's still well behind a number of other Western countries. Its investment flows to Africa are about equal to those of the United States today, but American investment stock in Africa is greater than China's, mainly because it's been doing it for a longer period of time. In terms of winning contracts, China is way in the lead. Chinese construction companies are basically overwhelmed the rest of the world in terms of winning the big infrastructure contracts in Africa. These are, however, based on loans. These are not grants. For the most part, this is not aid. This is a business deal where Chinese companies come in and build these projects, often with an element of Chinese labor involved. The reason that China is winning so many of these contracts is that it is able to offer financing for them. And the Western countries have not offered financing. So China is effectively filling a void that the West has given up to China. The interesting area in the most recent couple of years in terms of China's engagement in Africa is on the security side. China is clearly taking a greater interest in African security issues, and in large part, to protect Chinese interests. And that is why I think you are seeing the development of the first facility that China has ever established outside of China, the military base in Djibouti, which reputedly is to assist its effort at anti-piracy in the Gulf of Aden, but it also has implications beyond that. It's to be available to help evacuation of Chinese nationals, if necessary, in northeastern Africa, in the Gulf State area. It is to support peacekeeping operations where China has troops assigned to South Sudan, to Darfur. China has about 2,100 troops today assigned to UN peacekeeping missions in Africa. These are all important, relatively new developments in Chinese engagement in security issues in Africa. And I think you're going to see more and more of this as time passes, possibly even with the exception of, or with the addition even of additional military facilities in Africa, or in the northern rim of the Indian Ocean in places like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, other countries along the northern rim of the Indian Ocean.